Coming up next, my build for this year's Halloween. Well, hey guys, and welcome back to another Initiative Modeler. It is October of 2024, believe it or not, and that means it's time for another Halloween build. This year, what I've chosen to do is to make a book nook that's inspired by Disney's Haunted Mansion. It's going to feature this character that you see here. He is called the Caretaker, and I'm sure you're familiar with him. I happened to come across files to print this character from cgtrader.com, and I'll go more into detail about the figure here shortly. So book nooks, if you're unfamiliar with them, are little enclosures that house dioramas, and these are dioramas that are inspired by books or movies or just about any particular subject you can think of. And a few years ago, I created some book nooks for my kids. Let me show you them here. This one here is inspired by the movie Spirited Away, which I made for my daughter. My daughter-in-law is a big Lord of the Rings fan, so this one here contains a little hobbit house, and the book nook even includes two types of lighting, one for daytime and one depicting nighttime. And finally, here's one I did for my son based on The Dark Knight, one of his favorite graphic novels. So this is not only going to be a build in honor of Halloween, but it's also going to serve as my entry into this year's HobbyLink International Halloween Group Build. This is a fun event that takes place every year. This year it's been renamed in honor of Boyd Crompton, who sadly passed away earlier this year. It's a fantastic way to remember him. I have no doubt we're going to get some great entries. It's always fun to see what people come up with. Now the first thing I want to do is show you the enclosure I'll be using here. This is a pre-made enclosure that you can find at Michael's for $12.99. Now the enclosures that I made for my kids were all fashioned out of wood and styrene plastic, and in the middle of doing those enclosures, I didn't realize that people sold pre-made or pre-cut enclosures. You can find some sellers on Etsy, by the way, that sell enclosures of various sizes. Some of them can get quite elaborate. This one is pretty simple and measures about 4 by 9 by 6. So it's not terribly complicated to put together. It's actually very easy to do. And so what I'd like to do first is begin by showing you what comes inside this box, and we'll prep the pieces for our project. And after I do that, I'll talk to you a little bit more about the character I'll be featuring inside the diorama. All right, so taking a look at the enclosure we're going to be using here now, this is by Make Market, and it's labeled here Miniature Book Nook. And on the back side, you can see it gives you some very simple assembly instructions, and also provides the dimensions of the entire piece when it's put together. So let's go ahead and open up the box here. And this is how it's packaged. Let's go ahead and open up this one. Okay, so everything is laid out here now. Let me just go through the pieces. We've got the side pieces here. And we've got the back piece, which has a hole in it, which will be convenient for our wiring. This is going to go along the front edge, so therefore this is the top of the book nook. And then we have the bottom piece here. So as you can see, it comes in this light color, and I'd like to make it black, so there's two choices we have. We can obviously paint it, but what I think would look better is to stain it with this wood stain here. So I'm going to go ahead and get this area covered with newspaper so we can apply the wood stain next. Okay, so here are all the pieces now after having been stained. I let them dry out in the sun yesterday, so they are all set to go now. And I really do like the way this turned out. First of all, it doesn't look jet black, which is probably how it would have turned out had I painted it. And the fact that it looks a little faded here makes it appear older and aged, which goes along with our theme. Now, I did stain the interior of the panels as well, at least just to have a black background to begin with and to work with. I was initially going to paint in a lot of detail, but instead I'm going to physically add in more detail, and I'll let you know more of those plans a little later here. So I think, though, I will be painting the interior of the panels a dark blue, and that way if you do happen to see some of it, which I think you will, at least at the top, it'll appear like a dark night sky. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and set these aside for now. Let's go ahead and take a look at the figure and start work on them. Alright, so here we now have the 7 pieces that I've printed of the character and the dog. And there is, of course, one other piece that is the base that is included with the STL files, but of course I won't be using that. Now, this was sized at 91.64% is what it turned out to be, and that was simply determined by taking into account the display area and opening that I had to view the character, along with the amount of space inside the book nook. Now, my goal is to have the character completely visible from head to toe. The torso and the legs come connected together, so I simply looked at how high that would have been at 100%, and of course taking into account his head as well and hat, and adjusted it down accordingly to fit into my book nook enclosure. So as you look at the details here, you can tell the designer did a great job capturing the look of the character from his clothes that you see here to the shovel that's held in his left hand. And certainly by the facial expression that you can see of the caretaker down to that scared, terrified look. The scarf is a separate piece as well, and I was able to print it in this orientation here, which allowed me to put supports here along the backside so you can't really see where they were. And we also have his hat, which has some texture to it as well. And turning now to the lantern, which I have printed now in clear resin, and this of course is done for lighting. I plan on drilling a small little hole here on this end for the SMD, and the wire will be led along the back up to his wrist, then down the length of his right arm and out to the back of his coat. And lastly, a look at his poor little companion here. You can see his ribs and spine peeking through, the poor guy. But he does look a lot like the dog you see on the ride. Now, as usual, before beginning any project, I always like to do a little research, and I did find a couple of videos which I think you might find of interest if you want to know more about this character. I'll place the link down below. But in short, I've learned that the character is called Silas Crump, and this was in honor of an Imagineer with the same last name. The caretaker has been part of the Haunted Mansion since its inception and is the only living character at the mansion. He is the caretaker of the grounds around the mansion, as well as the cemetery also found on the grounds. On the ride, we see him standing at the gates of the cemetery, and he's come out to see what all the commotion is all about, and is terrified at what he finds. Now, as for the colors I'll be using on the character, I'm going to go by this picture here. There are other pictures you can find online in which he's clothed in more brownish tones, but I'd rather paint him this way because the colors are much more vibrant. Alright, so I've got to prime the pieces now, and we'll get started with painting. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I started with applying the base color of his coat with my airbrush, and this was followed by applying a lot of the shadows this way too. But for the highlights, I chose to do dry brushing instead. The sweater was hand-painted with a mix of Monument Hobbies blue and dark gray blue. After the coat and sweater were painted, I moved on to painting the pants by hand, and for the shadows and highlights, I used wet blending techniques. And I followed the same techniques for the scarf. Next, I moved on to his face, and after applying shadows and highlights, I painted his big eyes. And this is how it all turned out. You can see the designer did a great job capturing the likeness and expression on that face. Well, then it was on to the shovel, and I used my technique for simulated wood grain, which I've shown a number of times now. Basically, you start with an ivory color, then layer on various shades of brown, going from lighter to darker. The shovel was painted with Vallejo's oily steel, and this was dirtied up by splattering on some burnt umber to create rust and weathering. And this is a quick look at the figure now, with the exception, of course, of the right hand and lantern. Well, I also completed the dog figure, and for the base color I ended up mixing Craftsmart's light gray along with their burnt umber, and for the shadows I mixed in some darker gray and applied all of that with an airbrush. Now, one thing I did have trouble with was applying the highlights. I first tried with an airbrush, but that didn't look great. I also tried dry brushing, still didn't look right, and I ended up resorting to what you see here. And what I turned to was a Tamiya weathering kit. This is the one for Japanese Navy ships. There happened to be a light brown color that worked great for this, and I just rubbed it along all of the raised areas along the spine, shoulders, his nose, his ears, and a few other places. Okay, well now that the painting is done for the figures, I'm going to go ahead and set those aside. Next thing I'd like to work on is the lighting for the lantern before moving on to working on the details of the interior of the Book Nook. So the lantern, as you can see here now, has been painted with a gray-blue color from Vallejo, and you can see even the lantern fixture itself, the glass portion, has been painted too. However, that actually has been masked over with masking fluid, so I'm going to peel away the masking fluid now and paint over the lines that you see there crossing on the light fixture. Now, to get this lit, I'm using 2 nano-size SMDs, which I actually just got today. And these nano-size SMDs are pretty small. Here's one of them here. I actually have a yellow one and an orange one that will be going together, and they both flicker. So the idea is to drill a hole right into here to accommodate those 2 LEDs, and hopefully between the yellow and orange flickering, it'll give us the illusion of a lit lantern. Alright, so the hole has been drilled here. You can see I'm just using my Dremel to do that. And what we have now are the 2 SMDs. I've twisted them together and they're being inserted into the opening there. And let's go ahead and test it out and see how it looks. Alright, first of all, just excuse the washer that's going on in the background there. It's kind of making a bit of noise. What I have now is a AA power source. And let me go ahead and hook it up to the power source here and see if it works out. Alright, yeah, it looks great. Alright, just to quickly show you how this is going to work now, I have the hole that I made for accommodating the SMDs plugged up with plastic putty. I let that dry and then painted it black. The wires are glued here and here with super glue. This will attach now to his arm. The wires will feed through the back here and onto the underside of his arm, and they'll run towards his back and then out of the enclosure. Alright, well now that the figure is completed, the lantern is all set to go. It's time to move on to the enclosure, so let me take a minute here to show you what I have planned for the interior. Okay, well what I have in mind here for this Book Nook is inspired by this illustration showing the character standing near the entry to the cemetery. And what I've done here is to temporarily set this up just to talk these plans through with you guys. And the character now is standing in the middle of the Book Nook along with his dog. Let's go over what I'm going to do here on the right side of the character. Now you can see I've got a portion of that post that's part of the entry gate. And next to that is an iron rod fence. And this is something I was able to print off a file I got off of Etsy. Again, another example of how you can find just about anything when it comes to 3D printing. And I just looked up iron rod fence for 3D printing, and there it was. So I was able to print it to the dimensions I needed, and it fits perfectly there. Now, on this panel now, I'm actually going to be painting headstones and the cemetery there in the background, so when you look through that iron rod fence, you'll be able to see that. And also we'll be painting in a spooky sky, again, all in very similar style to what you see in this illustration. Now on the back side of the diorama, I'm just going to include some foliage there. Again, also extending the painting of the background there onto this panel. And so we'll have a night sky as well here and some other things painted into the background. And the wall that's not here will be covered with an extension, again, of the painting I'm doing with everything else in that same style, so it's going to be more of the landscape there on that side. Well, as for lighting now, obviously we'll be getting some from the lantern. This is the actual lantern now that's been wired up to the SMDs. I just showed you that a few minutes ago. But I also have some SMDs that are going to be hooked to the ceiling. They're going to be 2 mega-size SMDs. One's going to be blue, one is red. I thought that would be a nice combination to have in this display. And in addition to that, I'm going to be using this lightning circuit to simulate lightning. So this is something I got from Evans Designs, and you have 2 mega-size SMDs here that are wired to a special chip, and when turned on, it simulates lightning flashes. Okay, so those are the plans, and I'm ready to get started. The first thing I'm going to do is begin with painting and illustrating these panels. Alright, so these are the finished panels. Let me just summarize how I completed these. I started off first with creating this sketch, again based on that illustration, at least in that same style. And then I applied the various shades of blue for the sky and the foreground. So essentially I recreated this drawing onto the panels, and I did this in sections, starting off with this bottom corner. Once the tombstone was drawn in, I proceeded with painting, which is what I'm doing here. And essentially followed that same technique all the way through by tracing in one feature after the next. You can see I'm now painting in the crypts, and you can see this is how it turned out once everything was painted in. Now the same techniques were applied to the other two panels. This is just showing how I painted in the moon, just using a stencil there, blotting the white in with a paper towel. And then I painted the blues that were used in the sky over that. So we ended up now with two panels that have the cemetery, and this third one over here with a mansion out in the distance. And again, as I showed you there earlier, these pieces of the iron rod fence are going to mount over these, so you can see that scene right through them there. All right, so the next step will be to create the brick post. This is just a sample that I cut earlier to practice on. You can see it's been textured to look like stacks of bricks there. And so what I'm going to do next then is get started on this, and I'm going to follow a technique, at least partially anyway, of something that I came across on YouTube that my friend Mark Fraley had made me aware of. So let's go ahead and get started with that step now. So the first thing I want to do is create that brick texture that I showed you there, and for this we're going to use a texture roller. Now the technique that's shown in that video uses an X-Acto knife for this, but this is a texture roller that I got off of cults3d.com. I'll post a link down below, and it's pretty simple to use. I'm just going to press firmly onto the foamular and just go down the post here, and you can see we end up with the texture of brick. Now for the sides I'm going to do the same thing, except I'm just going to be pressing it here along the side, and to make sure these lines connect to the ones on the front here. And once that is done, there's another step we want to do, and we want to go ahead and texture this just a little further to create the little irregularities and little nooks and divots that are in brick. And to do that, we're going to use a piece of tin foil that we've rolled now, and just roll it all across the surface here, pressing again into the foamular. So it's a great way to create these little pits and things that you see on brick, just like that. Alright, so before I did anything else, I decided to first seal the foamular with Mod Podge, and it's been mixed here with a brown craft paint. This was also done to the pieces that will serve as the concrete bases for the post and the sections of iron rod fencing. Continuing on now with the brick post, I started applying some colors, first going to a burnt umber. This was followed by this orange-brown color called Spanish Tile from Craftsmart. Next, it was Engine Red from Folk Art mixed with a little bit of Espresso Brown from Craftsmart. Then it was bringing back some of the browns by going to Golden Brown from Monument Hobbies. And once this was all dry, I applied a black wash and then placed it into my food dehydrator for about 30 minutes. Now once I removed it from the dehydrator, I applied a gloss by just brushing on some acrylic floor polish, and what I'm showing you here is I'm just deepening the grooves between the layers of bricks, and you'll see the reason why in just a moment. So now it's time to create the mortar between the layers of bricks, and for this I'm going to be using this smooth finish product, and you can see this is smeared on to the piece, and now you can see why we wanted the deeper grooves. And once you wipe that away, it looks like mortar between the bricks. Now after the initial application, there were some areas that were a little light on the mortar, so I went back, deepened the grooves, and applied yet a bit more of the smooth finish. Now since the smooth finish is a very white color, I brushed on Vallejo's gray wash just to tone that down. Next, it was onto the concrete bases, first painting them with Craftsmart's gray. I textured them with the foil ball, then applied the Vallejo's gray wash to these as well. Okay, well here are the finished pieces. I'm very happy with how this turned out. Let me share with you now a piece that Mark Fraley did. Now as you can see here, he created an entire post, and for creating the bricks now he used an X-Acto knife rather than a texture roll. I actually think it looks better than mine, but nonetheless this technique works great to create a convincing simulation of brick. So what also helped with these concrete bases is the foil ball to add more texture there, and the wash really helped out as well. Now let's go ahead and take a second to put this onto our panel just to kind of see how this is looking. And so we've got the post here, the base is going to go here, and so of course we have the concrete base now for the fence. And yeah, I think this is going to work out great. So what I have to do next now is to weather the iron rod sections. And once that is done, we're getting really close to putting this together. I know I have to work on the base, but that's not going to take long. This is the base the figure is going to stand on. So I'll get you caught up here in just a moment. All right, let me take a minute just to show you how the lighting is going to work out. This, of course, is the ceiling to the enclosure. We've got 4 mega-size SMDs here. We've got a red one up front, a blue one towards the back. These two belong to this lightning circuit. Now I had to detach the little chip that creates this effect temporarily here because all of these wires have to fit through this hole that I've created here on the upper edge of the back wall. Now you'll notice that there are 2 styrene rods here and here, and the reason those are in place is because I'm going to also glue in a diffuser. This is just some clear styrene plastic that I've frosted over with some sandpaper. And the intent here is to create a more diffuse glow. I'd like to avoid having it look like spotlights. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and complete this. We'll move on to the final step, which is working with the base that the figure is going to stand on. All right, so you can see the figure now is in place along with his dog, and you can see I've also put in the foliage there in the background. So the base is a foamular that was coated with Mod Podge and some burnt umber paint, along with some terrain cover to create some texture. Once that was dried, it was glued onto the base with 2-part epoxy. And so what I'm doing here now is installing the figure, and I'm using 2-part epoxy to hold him in place, which I like using versus super glue. The foliage now is this stuff I got here at Michael's, and so it's working real well for both the bushes as well as putting them into these wooden pieces that I got at Hobby Lobby. They look like big tree branches, and I decided to glue on some of the moss onto those branches as well. And I also ended up putting this little log here at the bottom, which I think looks pretty good. All right, so the wires to his lantern now feed along the back here and they're going to tuck underneath his scarf. And the foliage now is going to help conceal them as they exit out of the enclosure. So I still need to apply a little glue here along his arm just to help secure that into place. And I made sure that when I painted the backside, I positioned the pre-drill hole towards the bottom, and that is where the wires are going to feed through. Okay, so we are then in the final stages here. All I need to do now is assemble the enclosure. And so I'm going to go ahead and get all that taken care of and show you the completed project in just a second. Okay guys, well here is the completed Haunted Mansion Book Nook. The figures are from cgtrader.com and were designed by Surgeman 2001, while the enclosure is from Make Market and was purchased at Michael's. I chose to print the figures at 94% of their intended size in order to fit into the enclosure, which makes him a 6-inch height from his feet to the top of his hat, and the dog is about half his height. So just a review now of the build. I started with first staining the pieces that came with the enclosure kit. The pieces easily took to the ebony stain, and I felt this method worked better than painting it black. The kit is easy to assemble, although I did have to use a rubber mallet at the end here to completely push all of the connecting slots together. Now, I would say there is one disadvantage to the kit, and that is that it makes no allowances for lighting, other than the pre-drilled hole towards the back. Now, what I mean by this is that when I custom created Book Nooks in the past, I allowed for some space within the interior where I could group all of the wires from the lights together. Some of the fancier enclosures actually include spaces like this, but bear in mind this is a basic enclosure. So if I were to do another Book Nook that required more than just a few lights with maybe some added effects like flashes and flickering, I would seek out another enclosure with this type of feature. In this case, since I was just keeping the Book Nook myself, I tidied up the wires on the back side and used black aluminum tape to conceal them and hold them in place. So this is just a consideration to keep in mind if you try to make a Book Nook for yourself. Moving on to the figures, they were well designed by Surgeman and were easy to assemble. From the clothing to the faces, I think he did a great job capturing the likenesses of the characters. I used a few pictures that I saw online as a paint guide for the colors, and I think they matched up pretty well. The files do come with a stand, but I created my own base for this one, since I had to work within the confines of the enclosure. One of the funnest parts of creating this type of diorama is decorating the interior. When I first came up with this idea, I was initially going to paint a lot of the interior, including the iron rod and brick post. But after more thought, I decided to create the brick post seen in the illustration I was using as a guide with using Foamular. When I chatted with my friend Mark Fraley about the project, he suggested viewing a video on YouTube that he knew of which showed a cool technique for creating simulated brick. So I used this method for the most part, and am very pleased with how it all turned out. I was also able to add on to this by finding an STL file for the iron rod fence. Again, this is something that is also seen in that illustration. I was going to attempt to scratch build it out of styrene rods, but I just happened to come across those files on Etsy and was able to have exactly what I was looking for. As you know, I spent a little extra time to paint illustrations onto all of the 3 interior panels, although I knew some of the drawings on the left and back panel would be obscured by other detailing. It was still fun to create it though, and I'm particularly happy with how the mansion I painted in on the right side looks with the interior lighting. Now, I knew from the beginning I would have to include some lighting, and my goal was to try to recreate the mood of the famous ride. So I chose to use a mix of reds and blues, which I knew would also go well with the colors I had planned for the interior. I recall that Evans Designs had a lightning kit, which I felt would make the display more dynamic, and it turned out to be a nice touch. So I'm really happy with how this all turned out. It's really pretty much what I had in mind from the beginning. My wife now has a fun, cool, unique display to add to her Halloween decorations that no doubt brings fond memories to anyone who has been on that famous ride. Now, one thing I did do was to add a window, as you can see here. This is just a barrier now to keep the interior from getting dusty. This is something I did do with my other book nooks, and I almost forgot about it till almost the end there. But it is something that you should consider because you have a lot of detail, and it's a small space there. If it were to get dusty, it would really be hard to clean that out. So one way to protect that is to add a barrier like this. It just so happened I had some extra clear styrene. This is a 1mm clear styrene I happened to have left over from those previous projects, actually from the last time I made a book nook, and it was just the right height. I just needed to cut the width down a little bit, and I was able to secure it with 2-part epoxy here, and a little bit down towards the bottom. Alright, well, I hope you enjoyed following along. Book nooks are a great way to challenge yourself creatively, in that you're limiting yourself to a small little space. So it kind of backs you into essentially a corner that you have to create your way out of. You have a certain thing in mind, and you want to try to fit everything in there. So it really gets you to thinking of how to go about doing that, and that's really part of the fun in this whole process. So I definitely would recommend it if you get a chance to give it a try. Getting a book nook like this, or at least an enclosure that is pre-made like through Michael's, is an inexpensive way to get started with this. And one other thing about book nooks is they make great gifts. I gave my kids book nooks a few years ago, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, and man, they just loved them. I've given a couple others away as well, and I guess it's no surprise, right? Because you're giving them something that you've made that is very unique, and it's something they can relate to or connect it to. So if you're running out of ideas for the holidays, this is something you can think about. Okay guys, well, thanks again for following along. As always, I really appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them here on my YouTube channel or at illustratormodeler@gmail.com. Thanks again for watching, and have yourself a very safe and happy Halloween. Take care.